On the morning of February 9, 1902, 3 experienced surveyors employed by the United States Geological Survey left the logging camp at Glacier Creek, Montana Territory, and began climbing into the Cabinet Mountains to complete what they believed would be their final winter traverse. None of them returned. The search that followed would become one of the longest in territorial history, but the answer to what happened was already written in a single line of the expedition log, dated the night before. Weather holding, will proceed via north approach despite advisory. Their names were Robert Dalton, Chief Surveyor, age 34, Martin Haskell, Assistant Surveyor, age 27, James Everett Cullen, Camp Recorder, age 41. All 3 men had spent the previous 14 months mapping the remote valleys and ridgelines of northwest Montana for the extension of the Great Northern Railway. Their work was considered essential. The railroad needed accurate elevation profiles and gradient calculations before laying track through the mountain passes. And winter surveys, though dangerous, provided the clearest sight lines through terrain otherwise obscured by summer growth. Dalton had led 6 previous winter expeditions without incident. Haskell was known among loggers for his speed on snowshoes and his ability to read avalanche-prone slopes. Cullen, the eldest, was a meticulous note-taker whose field journals were cited in congressional reports. They were not amateurs. They were not thrill-seekers. They were federal employees performing a contracted task under deadline. The logging camp they departed from was owned by the Blackfoot Milling Company and sat at an elevation of 4,200 feet, just below the tree line. It consisted of 11 structures, most of them bunkhouses for the seasonal crews who worked the timber harvests each spring and summer. By February, only a skeleton staff remained. The camp superintendent, 2 cooks, a blacksmith, and a rotating crew of 4 men tasked with maintaining equipment and clearing snow from the access road. The surveyors had been granted use of a supply cabin on the eastern edge of the camp. It was there, on the evening of February 8th, that Dalton made the entry in the expedition log. Weather records from the nearest meteorological station, located in Kalispell, some 60 miles south, show that a high-pressure system had settled over the region on February 6th. Temperatures had risen to 28 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, with clear skies and light winds. By all appearances, conditions were stable, but the camp superintendent, a man named Arthur Goss, had sent word to the surveyors that morning, advising them to delay their departure. Goss had lived in the Cabinet Mountains for 11 years. He had seen men lost to weather that appeared calm at lower elevations, but turned lethal above 6,000 feet. His concern was not the visible sky. It was the date. February 9th marked the beginning of what old-timers in the region called the break. A brief window, usually 3 to 5 days long, when winter's grip loosened just enough to destabilize the snowpack. Avalanches were common during this period. Cornices collapsed. Ice bridges over creeks gave way. It was a time when experienced mountaineers stayed low or stayed put. Goss had mentioned this to Dalton twice, once in passing on February 7th and again, more directly, on the morning of the 8th. Dalton's response, as recorded in a letter Goss later provided to investigators, was polite but firm. The survey team was behind schedule. They had already lost 4 days to a storm in late January. The railway company had made it clear that delays would not be tolerated. Dalton stated that they would proceed using the north approach, a route that avoided the higher ridges where avalanche danger was greatest. He thanked Goss for his concern but did not alter his plan. The north approach was not inherently reckless. It followed a series of forested benches and shallow drainages that offered some protection from slides. It was longer than the standard ridge route by nearly 2 miles, but it was considered safer in marginal conditions. Dalton had used it once before, in March of the previous year. What he did not account for, or perhaps did not know, was that the north approach crossed 3 tributary gullies that funneled runoff from the upper slopes. In winter, those gullies filled with wind-loaded snow. In early February, during the break, they became chutes. At 6:15 on the morning of February 9th, the 3 men shouldered their packs, strapped on their snowshoes, and walked north into the timber. The camp cook, a woman named Ida Pruitt, watched them go. She would later testify that the sky was cloudless and the air was still. She remembered thinking it looked like a good day. Survey work in the Cabinet Mountains during winter was methodical and unglamorous. The men traveled light, carrying only what they could use or consume within 3 days. Rope, compass, aneroid barometers for measuring altitude, notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, dried meat, hardtack, tea, and a small spirit stove for melting snow. They slept in canvas tarps, strung between trees, or if the weather turned, in shallow snow caves dug into drifts. There was no romance in it. It was cold, repetitive labor performed in isolation, often in conditions that made writing difficult and conversation sparse. Dalton's team had developed a routine. They rose before dawn, ate a cold breakfast, and began walking by first light. They moved in single file, with Haskell breaking trail on snowshoes, Dalton following with the instruments, and Cullen bringing up the rear with the notebooks. Every half mile, they stopped to take readings. Dalton would call out the barometric pressure and compass bearing. Cullen would record it. Then they moved on. By midday, they would have covered 3 to 4 miles and taken 12 to 16 measurements. They would rest for 30 minutes, eat, and continue until the light failed. At dusk, they made camp. This pattern had carried them through the entire winter. Between November 1901 and early February 1902, they had completed surveys of 7 separate drainages, covering more than 60 miles of unmapped terrain. Their work was precise. Railway engineers in Spokane relied on their numbers to calculate grades and estimate construction costs. There was no tolerance for error, but the railway company's timeline was unforgiving. The original contract had stipulated completion by the end of January. Weather delays and an equipment failure in December had pushed that deadline back. By the first week of February, Dalton was under pressure from both his direct supervisor in Helena and the railway's chief engineer. A telegram sent to the Glacier Creek camp on February 5th read, "Complete North Sector survey by 15th or contract void, no extensions." Dalton acknowledged receipt the same day. It was this pressure, documented in both the telegram and in a letter Dalton sent to his wife in Missoula on February 6th, that shaped his thinking. The North Sector was a single ridge and 2 adjacent valleys. Under ideal conditions, it could be surveyed in 4 days. Dalton believed he had 5, maybe 6, if the weather held. He could not afford to wait. Arthur Goss, the camp superintendent, had tried to explain the danger without overstepping. Goss was not a surveyor. He was a timberman. His authority began and ended at the camp's property line. But he understood the mountains in a way that came from years of watching men make small mistakes that compounded into disasters. He had seen slides take out entire sections of forest. He had pulled bodies from snowpack in April that had been buried since January. He knew that the break was not a suggestion. It was a fact of the place. On the evening of February 8th, Goss found Dalton in the supply cabin, packing gear by lantern light. He asked if the team would consider waiting 48 hours. Dalton said they could not. Goss asked if they would at least take the ridge route, which was more exposed but faster and more predictable. Dalton said they would not. The north approach was safer. Goss said nothing more. He returned to his own cabin and made a note in the camp log. Survey team departing AM against council. Weather fair. That same evening, Cullen wrote a letter to his daughter in Butte. It was found later among his personal effects. In it, he mentioned the upcoming traverse and expressed confidence that the work would be finished by mid-February. He wrote, "The conditions are as good as we could hope for. Dalton knows these mountains better than any man I've worked with. I expect to be home before the month is out." The letter was never sent. It remained in his pack. The night was clear. The temperature dropped to 19 degrees. There was no wind. In his journal, Dalton noted the barometric pressure and added a single line. "North approach confirmed. Departure at dawn." He signed his initials beneath it, closed the book, and extinguished the lamp. At 6:15 the following morning, the 3 men left camp and entered the forest. The snow was firm. The sky was pale blue. Everything looked exactly as it should. The first mile of the north approach followed a gradual incline through dense lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The snow beneath the canopy was stable, compacted by weeks of cold, and the grade was gentle enough that the men made good time. Haskell led, his snowshoes leaving a clean trail in the surface crust. Dalton followed at a distance of 15 feet, adjusting his pack and checking the compass every few minutes. Cullen stayed close behind, his breath visible in the still air. None of them spoke. There was no need. By 7:30 they had reached the first bench, a flat, open area roughly 200 yards wide, where the timber thinned and the ground leveled out before rising again toward the ridgeline. Dalton called a halt. They removed their packs and took the first set of readings. The altitude was 5,400 feet. The air temperature was 26 degrees. Dalton noted both figures aloud. Cullen copied them into the field book with a pencil he kept in his breast pocket, wrapped in cloth, to prevent the graphite from freezing. The process took 4 minutes. Then they shouldered their packs and continued. The second mile was steeper. The trail, if it could be called that, was little more than a series of clearings between clusters of trees, linked by shallow depressions where runoff had carved narrow channels in the slope. This was the section Dalton had described as safer. The forest provided some shelter from wind, and the drainages, though numerous, were too small to accumulate the kind of snowmass that triggered large slides. At least, that was the assumption. What Dalton could not have known, because it was not visible from below, was that the upper slopes above the north approach had been loaded with wind-driven snow throughout the previous week. The high-pressure system that brought clear skies to the valley had also brought sustained winds at higher elevations, winds that stripped snow from exposed ridges and deposited it in the gullies and chutes below. By February 9th, those deposits had formed layers of unstable snow resting on older, harder surfaces. The warming temperatures of the break had begun to weaken the bonds between those layers. The snowpack was primed. It needed only a trigger. At approximately 9 o'clock, the men reached the base of the first tributary gully. It was perhaps 30 feet wide and angled upward at roughly 35 degrees. Fresh snow had drifted into it, softening the contours and creating a smooth, unbroken surface. Haskell paused at the edge. According to the reconstruction based on track evidence found later, he stepped into the gully, tested the snow with his weight, and then proceeded upward. Dalton followed. Cullen waited at the base, as was protocol, until both men had crossed. The gully was stable. The men moved through it without incident and continued climbing. By 9:45, they had gained another 300 feet in elevation and were approaching the second gully. This one was wider, nearly 50 feet across, and its upper terminus disappeared into a band of cliffs and broken rock that marked the beginning of the ridge proper. The angle was steeper, close to 40 degrees. Haskell stopped. Exactly what was said at this point is not recorded. There were no witnesses. There were no notes. But the physical evidence suggests a pause. Boot prints and snowshoe tracks found by searchers in late February showed that all 3 men had stood together at the base of the second gully for some time, long enough to pack down the snow in a small area, which indicated discussion or deliberation. It is likely that Haskell expressed concern. It is possible that Dalton assessed the slope and judged it passable. What is certain is that they did not turn back. Haskell crossed first. His tracks ascended the gully in a diagonal line, angling toward a cluster of small fir trees on the far side. He reached them without difficulty. Dalton followed the same line. His tracks paralleled Haskell's, offset by about 6 feet. He also reached the far side. Then Cullen began to cross. Cullen was heavier than the other 2 men. He was also less experienced on snowshoes. He moved more slowly, placing each step with care. He was approximately 2/3 of the way across the gully, roughly 30 feet from the edge, when the slope released. The avalanche was not large by alpine standards. It was classified later as a Class 2 slab slide, involving perhaps 2,000 cubic yards of snow. But in the confined space of the gully, it was more than sufficient. The initial fracture occurred above Cullen, at a point where the new snow had accumulated against a band of wind crust. The fracture propagated downslope in both directions, breaking loose a slab roughly 40 feet wide and 2 to 3 feet deep. The slab began to move. Cullen had no time to react. The snow beneath him collapsed and he went down with it, tumbling forward as the slide accelerated. Haskell and Dalton, standing on the far side, shouted, though whether in warning or alarm is impossible to say. The slide moved quickly, funneling downslope and carrying Cullen with it. Within seconds, he had been swept out of sight. The snow ran for approximately 150 vertical feet before slowing and coming to rest in a natural depression at the base of the gully. When it stopped, the surface was chaotic. Blocks of compacted snow mixed with broken branches, dirt, and ice. There was no sign of Cullen. Dalton and Haskell descended immediately. They abandoned their packs and moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, shouting Cullen's name. They reached the debris field within minutes and began searching. They probed the snow with their hands and with lengths of broken branch. They called out. They listened. The forest was silent. At some point, likely within the first 30 minutes, Dalton made a second decision. He could not have known it would be his last. He told Haskell to continue searching. He would return to camp for help. He would bring more men, ropes, shovels. He would return by nightfall. Haskell agreed. Dalton turned and began descending the slope. Neither man was ever seen again. When Dalton did not return to Glacier Creek by sunset on February 9th, Arthur Goss assembled a search party. It consisted of himself, the blacksmith, and 2 loggers who knew the northern approaches. They left camp at first light on February 10th, following the surveyor's tracks through the lower timber. The weather had turned. A light snow had begun to fall overnight, and by morning, the wind had picked up. Visibility was reduced to less than a quarter mile. Goss and his men reached the first bench by mid-morning. The tracks were still visible, though partially filled. They pressed on. By noon they had found the second gully. The avalanche debris was unmistakable, a wide swath of churned snow and broken trees cutting down the slope. The men stopped and began to search. They found Cullen within the first hour. His body was buried under approximately 4 feet of compacted snow, 30 yards below the point where the slide had released. He was face down, arms extended, as though he had tried to swim. He was not breathing. Goss and the blacksmith dug him out and laid him on the snow. There were no visible injuries. He had likely suffocated within minutes. They did not find Dalton or Haskell. Goss spent the remainder of the afternoon searching the debris field and the surrounding area, but the fresh snow was making it difficult to distinguish old tracks from new. By 3 o'clock, the wind had intensified and the temperature had dropped. Goss made the decision to return to camp with Cullen's body. He would organize a larger search the following day. That search never materialized. On the night of February 10th, a winter storm moved into the Cabinet Mountains. Snow fell continuously for the next 60 hours. By the time the weather cleared on February 13th, more than 3 feet of new snow had accumulated at higher elevations. The surveyor's tracks were gone. The debris field was buried. Any hope of finding Dalton and Haskell alive was abandoned. Official search efforts resumed on February 15th, led by a U.S. Marshal from Kalispell and a team of 12 men recruited from nearby logging camps. They spent 8 days combing the slopes above the second gully, probing snow, checking drainages, and marking areas for follow-up searches in the spring. They found nothing. On February 23rd, the search was called off due to deteriorating weather and the risk to the searchers themselves. The railway company suspended the survey contract on February 28th. The U.S. Geological Survey conducted an internal review and concluded that Dalton had exercised reasonable judgment given the information available to him at the time. No formal fault was assigned. Arthur Goss provided a written statement to investigators in which he described his warnings to Dalton and expressed regret that he had not been more forceful. The statement was filed with the territorial records and largely forgotten. In April, after the snowmelt had begun, a second search was organized. It was led by a group of volunteers, including 2 of Haskell's brothers who had traveled from Ohio. They searched for 11 days. On April 19th, they found Dalton's body in a ravine approximately 400 yards west of the second gully. He was partially buried under debris from a secondary slide. His pack was missing. His clothing was torn. The cause of death was determined to be trauma consistent with a fall. There was no evidence that he had been caught in the original avalanche. He had likely been attempting to descend when he triggered a second, smaller slide, or had simply lost his footing on unstable ground. Haskell was never found. Searches continued intermittently through the summer of 1902, but no trace of him was recovered. His name was added to the Territorial Registry of Missing Persons, where it remained until Montana achieved statehood in 1907. After that, the file was transferred to state archives and eventually sealed. James Everett Cullen was buried in Butte on February 18, 1902. Robert Dalton was buried in Missoula on April 27. Martin Haskell's family held a memorial service in Akron, Ohio, on May 10, but there was no grave. In the final report submitted to the U.S. Geological Survey, the incident was attributed to adverse weather conditions and terrain hazards inherent to winter survey operations. The railway company hired a new survey team in March and completed the work by July. The north approach was never used again. In the summer of 1954, a fire lookout stationed in the Cabinet Mountains reported finding human remains near the headwaters of Glacier Creek at an elevation of approximately 6,800 feet. The remains were skeletal and partially scattered by animals. They were located in a narrow drainage roughly 1 mile east of the second gully, where Cullen had been buried and Dalton had been found. A canvas pack frame, badly deteriorated, was discovered nearby, along with fragments of leather and a single snowshoe binding made of brass. The remains were examined by the county coroner and tentatively identified as those of Martin Haskell, based on the location, the age of the artifacts, and the absence of any other missing persons reports from the area. However, formal identification was not possible. Dental records were incomplete, and no surviving family members could be located for confirmation. The remains were interred in an unmarked grave in the Libby Municipal Cemetery on August 12, 1954. A brief notice appeared in the local newspaper noting the discovery and the presumed connection to the 1902 survey incident. No further investigation was conducted. The official file on the disappearance, maintained by the Montana State Archives, contains 73 pages of documents, witness statements, search reports, correspondence between the railway company and federal authorities, and copies of the surveyor's field notes recovered from Glacier Creek Camp. The file also includes Arthur Goss's handwritten account of the events leading up to the departure on February 9th, which he submitted in March of 1902. In it, he describes his conversations with Dalton and his reasons for advising delay. He concludes with the following: "I do not believe Dalton was reckless. He was pressed by deadlines and believed the route was sound. He was wrong, but he could not have known that until it was too late." The railway line that the surveyors had been mapping was completed in the fall of 1903. It ran through the southern Cabinet passes, bypassing the northern sector entirely. The decision to reroute was made for engineering reasons unrelated to the incident, though some accounts suggest that the difficulty of the terrain and the loss of the survey team contributed to the railway company's willingness to explore alternatives. The line operated until 1981, when it was abandoned due to declining freight traffic. Portions of the old railbed are now used as logging roads and hiking trails. The field journal kept by Robert Dalton was returned to his widow in Missoula. She donated it to the Montana Historical Society in 1919, along with his surveying instruments and personal papers. The journal is stored in the Society's manuscript collection and is available to researchers by appointment. The final entry, dated February 8, 1902, reads, "Weather holding. Will proceed via north approach despite advisory. There is no marker at the site of the avalanche. The forest has reclaimed the slope. The second gully, where the slide occurred, is indistinguishable now from dozens of others that cut through the mountains. Snow still accumulates there each winter. The break still comes in early February. The conditions that killed James Cullen and set in motion the events that followed have not changed. They were not exceptional. They were ordinary. What remains is the question of whether Dalton's decision was avoidable. The answer, almost certainly, is yes. Had he waited 2 days, the break would have passed. The snowpack would have stabilized. The survey could have been completed without incident. But to wait would have meant violating the contract deadline, risking his professional reputation, and possibly losing the railway work that supported his family. Dalton weighed those risks against the risks of the mountain and chose the mountain. It was not an irrational choice. It was a human one. In the end, the disappearance of Dalton, Haskell, and Cullen was not the result of a storm, or an equipment failure, or a navigational error. It was the result of a single decision, made under pressure, based on incomplete information and reasonable confidence. The mountain did not ambush them. It responded to them. They broke one rule, Arthur Goss's rule, the one rule that locals understood and outsiders learned too late, and the mountain took the rest. The file in the Montana State Archives has not been opened in more than 30 years. The names are listed, the dates are recorded, and the decision is preserved. That is all that remains.